Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone today, our noontime presentation. Of course, during the Knowledge and Culture Week at Kiuna College. Here, well, at least we're online, but located, on the land of Odanak, the traditional Abenaki territory. And as we know, the theme of Knowledge and Culture Week has been territory. And our guest today, our special guest, brings great wisdom and experience on this topic. I am Jennifer Nolt. I'll be your moderator for today's presentation, and I'm an English language educator at Kiuna College. So I'm very honored to have the opportunity to welcome and introduce our special guest, our distinguished guest, Ellen Gabriel, and she's here to speak with us today. Ellen Gabriel is from the community of Canastage, and she is an Indigenous human rights activist, a visual artist, and since 1990 has been advocating for the collective and individual human rights of Indigenous people. She's worked diligently to bring awareness to the history, culture, and identity of Indigenous people. And she might be known from also when she became more known in the public when her community of Canastage chose her to be their spokesperson during the 1990 Oka crisis. She's made numerous public presentations on Indigenous rights and history, including presentations to Parliamentary and Senate Committees, as well Quebec's National Assembly on legislative amendments affecting the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And on the international level as well, she's participated at the UN's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as negotiations on the Nagoya Protocol of the Convention on Biodiversity, and advocated for Indigenous languages and cultures at the UN Expert Mechanism of the Rights of Indigenous People. She's also served as the president of the Quebec Native Women's Association. That was starting in 2004. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome Ellen Gabriel. She is here as part of our Knowledge and Culture Week. And I want to thank everyone here, all the attendees, as we welcome our special guest today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I just want to bring first my language in, so there's not going to be any translation for that, but it's important for me to begin in my language. Nena kahkota no negonos tasara kono no quatsara tanis konya tasara awado in guasali tani kiawi tino warato oni ye teknis ta hunta nena gwaganota yun kiawi tano gwaganota yukoyote te tino warato oni gwagote da wanere ati oni teriyo kisa oni teradi yora kote tano wakatsano oni sitas kungarawi kisa oni teradi. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge all those life givers that bring us, food, nourishment, and so I think the natural life cycles, all our relations, Creator, and of course Mother Earth, who we're going to be talking about today. This is the crux of the situation that Indigenous people find themselves in trying to protect Mother Earth and to make sure that the present generation and future generations are allowed and permitted the opportunity to be able to enjoy what we have today, but also to be able to survive climate change. So long ago, someone did that for us, and so it's our obligation today to make an effort to make sure that future generations are able to enjoy the earth. I have a really small PowerPoint presentation. I also said, I just wanted to add, I also said thank you for inviting me today in my language. So I'm going to share a screen, and as I warned, I warned the organizers, I'm not technologically savvy, so I hope you can indulge me. I'm going to share my screen and do okay. That's from the beginning. All right. So something that I think is really always pushed in. I'm getting this message that my internet connection is unstable, so let me know if you can't hear me. Um, in 1990, we had our elders who advised me and others had told us that the issues that Indigenous people are facing should be met on an international level because we are nations. Now, there's a lot of debate. Some people call themselves Canadians. Some others are forced to carry Canadian citizenship simply under duress because there's no other option. So I wanted to start off a quote from the Chief Justice, Supreme Court of Canada, the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin, who said Aboriginal rights from the beginning have been shaped by international concepts. More recently, emerging international norms, Aboriginal issues. Canada as a respected new international norm. Whether we like it or not, Aboriginal rights are an international matter too. What we see happening since over 500 centuries is this doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which because Europeans felt that if people were not Christian, they were not considered human beings. But on top of that, the genocide that happened against Indigenous people. The first U.S. Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Issues, Rudolfo Stevenhagen, had done a study which estimated that at least 3/4 of the Indigenous populations within the Americas were dead after 1 century of contact from war and disease. So you can imagine the knowledge that has been lost, even some of our language, parts of our language that has been lost. So when we talk about language and we talk about the territory or land, we're talking about those very relationships that our ancestral teachings give to us, which is you have to respect the earth, because this is where you get your food. But not only that, we see her as our mother. And many Indigenous populations, especially in the Americas, see the earth as their mother. And, in Iroquois culture, we do something that's called Ahan de Gariwatepa, which are the words that are said before all else. And we say these things before every single meeting, whether it has to do with a ceremony session, because in the Haudenosaunee tradition, our political entities are intertwined, they're not separate. And so when we do Ahan de Gariwatepa that don't have a voice, we are supposed to begin that we are making is going to affect them. And if we look at what's going on in the world today, there is this neoliberal sort of attitude where economics is primary, and economic asserts there's a focus just on the economic growth, and neoliberalism asserts that social justice is best maintained by minimal government interference, the free market forces. So we see what's going on today, which is whether it was the Obama administration, especially the last Trump administration, the focus was on economic and structure of society. It does not balance well with the natural environment. So there's a lot of stuff that we need to think about. And so genocide, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and also the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples mentions genocide. And you don't necessarily have to wipe out a whole group of people. What has to happen are the following five. And peoples are people who have a land base, which Indigenous people do, whether it's an occupied land base as we see today. They have a language, they have a system of governance, and this whole social aspect that we see Indigenous people, the diversity of Indigenous people from all over Mother Earth. We see each one is different, but the foundation of it really relies on land. So this is one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind. The Premier of Quebec has said there is no such thing as systemic racism. And yet, we see many examples of it throughout Canadian society, in particular in Quebec society. So in 1990, you had inconvenienced motorists in Chateauguay burning nightly effigies of what they said were Mohawk warriors. And then the most recent tragedy of Joyce Echaquan. And it's really something that people have been grappling with for at least decades, since I've been born. And there's like a very minor effort, a very apathetic or pathetic effort by governments to deal with those issues, especially when it comes to Indigenous people. As the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report talks about, people were not even aware, and even Indigenous leaders, I can honestly say, because I was with Quebec Native women and I worked with Bev Jacobs, who was one of the authors of the Stolen Sisters report, did not feel that this was an important enough issue to bring to the forefront as we see now. So we look at land and the people of that land and how they're treated. They're not separate. As we see, they are intertwined, like all human rights. They're interrelated, interconnected, they are universal, and so on. And the denial or the abuse and violation of one right impacts all those rights. So the right to self-determination, that's a concept that is very Western. When Indigenous people talk about their self-determination, what we're really talking about is what I mentioned, which is bringing in all those silent voices of the fish, the water, the trees, the birds, the medicines, etc., into the discussions that we're having. And when a separation of that part of our identity, that identity that we carry, but we're suppressing as Indigenous people. So for me as a Haudenosaunee person, Haudenosaunee is an Onondaga word. In Ganyakaha, or in the Ganyakahagan Nation, we say Urodiru Sethag, so people of the Longhorn. And yesterday was Veterans Day or Memorial Day, and someone posted something about lasagna. And when people think about 1990, they think about guys with weapons and camouflage and masks. They don't think about the women who were very courageous and went to right in the face of the Citizens Quebec or the Canadian Army without weapons. There were also a lot of men that did not have weapons. And I want to frame the resistance of land defenders as we are always told that we need to be peaceful. We always like to label, we are doing a peaceful protest. The violence has always been initiated by the state. Why? Because of those very reasons of neoliberalism, that agenda, which has always been there since 500 centuries, which is an economic agenda, which is to make a group of people, as Frantz Fanon states, to make them believe that the colonized versions of their identity and who they are, that we internalize that, so that we accept the colonizer's version of us, and we accept those things that the colonizers is telling us. These are what a good person does. This is what a radical does. And so as we know, the Indian Act was designed to undermine the roles, authority of Indigenous women. What we see today is a very mixed up, dysfunctional group of communities throughout Canada. And if you look right across Canada, women are at the forefront. Women have always been there. They have been the ones that have created positive changes, if you can call it that, in one of the most racist acts that exists in the world today, which is the Indian Act. So I want to emphasize the role that Indigenous women play. We don't have fancy headdresses. We're not like peacocks where everybody will notice us. We are just doing our job because under our constitution, which predates European arrival, we are obliged to protect the land. And what has happened is the imposition of band councils. And I really don't want to offend anybody, but band council system has not benefited Indigenous people one way or another. Because at the end of the day, the Minister of Indian Affairs, and I'm going to call ourselves Indian because under Canada's Indian Act, we are still illegally in. It's only the minister that can approve whether it's election codes, whether it's land use. It's only the minister that can do that. And so sometimes, the band council system, for whatever good intent they may have, they are really actually a hindrance to the justice and equality that Indigenous people are seeking. The 1492 land back lane, their band council made an agreement with a developer without consulting the community. Here in Gunnesadauga, the same thing has happened in the last 30 years. Band councils, secret meetings, making decisions without consulting the people. And I want to bring in now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other conventions which have legal obligations, which are comprised in and mentioned in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Indigenous people and their lands, resources, and territories can be used. It says, it emphasizes that it requires all corporations and crown actors, that means whether they're provincial, federal, or municipal, or band councils, must practice and uphold the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. And in many instances, consent can be withheld after all those other processes have happened. Because if Indigenous people feel that this is going to negatively impact the health of the environment, the health of the people, then they have that right to say no. And last year, we were able to march around without masks. And I attended this wonderful youth-led class. What we see is multi-generations taking up the gauntlet of defending the land, of defending their rights as Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. And within that march itself, there's a lot of people that don't understand what Indigenous people's right to self-determination means and what land back means. Land back means we take care of the land. We need to survive, yes, and as one of my friends, Clifton Nicholas, says, we are the only species on Earth that has to pay to exist. We have to have money to exist. And so when we're talking about land back, we're talking about preserving those lands and being able to live in a sustainable way, to be able to live so that we have clean water, we have food sovereignty, we have social sovereignty, all the things that are part of self-determination, which do not exist today. This existed, a couple of centuries ago, or maybe 150 years ago. But what we see today is exploitation of Canada and third parties and provinces exploiting Indigenous people's rights through the use of police brutality, through the use of violence. And, we don't have the human resources, nor do we have the financial resources to fight back. As the Mi'kmaq lobster fishermen case is evident, even when we go to the Supreme Court, those rights are not protected or respected, and that's the whole thing. These are rights that are not respected. So we have to see land and all that's interconnected to the health of the land and perpetuating our species. I think that this is what we're talking about. The Earth is billions of years old, billions. We can't even fathom that concept because we're such a young species. She doesn't need us to survive. We need her, and we need all those things that are on this earth to survive with us. So all the work that we're doing, it's not just for human beings and future generations, like we're always talking about. It's also future generations of the deer, future generations of the moose, future generations of the fish, etc., etc. And one of the things that we have been fighting for here in Ganasadaga with Oka, and Oka is the colonial name. In 2004, Canada created this Parliamentary Act, which is so oppressive and has been the bane of our existence, which was called S24, the Interim Ganasadaga Land Management Act, which created that delineation, that invisible boundary of here's Oka and here's Ganasadaga. Well, Ganasadaga existed long before Europeans arrived here. And it's when I think about the hoops that we have to jump through to prove this is our land and justify our rights to protect it, I look at disciplines like archaeology and anthropology, and this mythological St. Lawrence Iroquois that was created on our territory, whether it's in Montreal along the St. Lawrence, to Ganasadaga, to the Great Lakes, this mythological St. Lawrence Iroquois that they say weren't here when the Sulpicians brought those Christian Nipissings, Mohawks, and Algonquins. So what we're saying is that this is land that is, and anybody who buys land is doing so, or anybody who's selling land is fraud. So this is this Latin phrase, this dead language, which still is used in medicine and law that we're using. And so this is the thing about neoliberalism. So I see that I'm going a little bit over, but I do want to say that lack of knowledge and awareness of the general public is inexcusable in 2020 about Indigenous peoples' human rights. It's intentional. The erasure of the role that Indigenous women have played throughout all these centuries of contact, it's inexcusable. The role that third parties are playing in land dispossession, which Canada and the provincial government remain silent, is inexcusable. Land dispossession, there is no excuse for it today. And yet, the picture that you see is what we're enduring. And we have been criminalized. We have been discredited, not only by the government and the municipality of Oka, again with another racist, misogynistic mayor, but by the band council. So we see that assimilation has been very, very successful, and it's how to combat them. Well, we need the full and effective participation of all people who are rights holders. We need a gender-based, equitable participation in all kinds of discussions that are going on. We need to start thinking about not just the human beings, but what our ancestral teachings teach us, which is you need to speak on behalf of all those living, and we need to include, if there's going to be any reconciliation, which to me has not happened, if there's going to be any reconciliation, and if we're going to continually tout to use the excuse of not following the rule of law, if there's going to be any reconciliation, there needs to be the inclusion of Indigenous law as part of the legal remedies or access to remedies of disputes that we see going on right across Canada. So I'm going to end my presentation for now, and thank you for listening.
I want to thank you for your presentation and for sharing your wisdom with us. And this is a the best time to open the floor to our attendees and have our question period. So, covered a lot of a lot of material here. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand to ask Ellen Gabriel your question. So I encourage, I see some of my students here too, so I would love to see a question come forward. Is there a particular,
Maybe you can ask me a question, Jen.
yeah, I'm wondering if there's a particular topic that you could cover would be something you could maybe share with the students here at Kiuna College. You spoke about fighting colonial norms. Are there particular ways that young people can be doing this? Can become more active in this fight?
I think the best way to educate oneself is to listen to elders. That's exactly what I did. I went to the Longhouse. It was a slow incline of my learning curve. So listening is a really important thing, and to have the knowledge of Western, like the Western law, and understanding like the international human rights norms, which to me are a lot more stronger than the domestic laws.
Mhm.
And Canada has yet to raise the standards of its domestic laws. And they keep talking about getting rid of the Indian Act, but it's how are you going to get rid of the Indian Act if so many people are tethered to it? It benefits so many people. But I think people can educate themselves also by reading Indigenous writers. Maybe not all Indigenous writers. There are some people that I think are it's a little bit skewed, and nothing that is machismo oriented. That is actually more oriented towards the ancestral teachings. And I know I have a lot of family members who are Christian, but they still have a strong identity of themselves, and they still believe
Mhm.
it's our right to protect the land. So it's going beyond the religious and ideological beliefs, and seeing what the science is against the facts.
Mhm.
These are the facts, right? Um, and put away those biases and take a look at what's going on, because there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I grew up not in the internet generation. I grew up where you had to write or type your term papers,
Right.
right? So it was listening and reading books
Right.
and about yourself and your people. But today there's a wealth of information for you out there, and it's to educate yourself uh, first about your identity. That'd be the most primary thing, and advice that I would give about who you are. Either you're a Tikamek, Innu, EU, or whatever you are. Educate yourself about your people, about the history of your land, um, about the gender discrimination. Read the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples,
Right.
the TRC, Murdered and Missing. And this is so much. There's a wealth of information just in those reports and commissions that can help get you going. And to understand that state violence is what kept people oppressed and scared to make the change, and we got to overcome that.
It's almost as though state violence is the norm, and to be aware of changing the paradigm as part
It's
of,
it's the state norm.
yeah.
It's the norm, as I said. After first century of contact, 3/4 of the indigenous populations were dead from war or disease, and it's continuing in 2020, as we saw with Joyce Echaquan's death.
I'm sure our students really appreciate some of those words. And I'm reading now. I think we have a couple of questions from attendees as well. This is from Kazaya Etienne. Uh, this is the question. Some of the excuses given by municipalities and the governments to not give back land is because there are already people living there. What
Mhm.
are your views on this excuse?
Well, let's stop all development. This is something we've asked the federal government is put a moratorium on all development, and they refuse. They refuse because it benefits them economically. That's the whole agenda. That's the whole colonial agenda. Um, My personal perspective is that sure, stay in your homes. We're not going to kick you out of your homes.
Yeah.
We've had that done to us, so we know what that's like to lose your home. We're not going to take the keys from your home, but the land is ours. That land belongs to our people. So you should be paying royalties to our people so we can reestablish those institutions like our language, like our culture, all those things that make a people a nation, a self-determining nation, a self-sufficient nation. But they have to stop the development because that's their excuse. Oh, there's another house built. Sorry, we can't give the land back. Well, sorry, in our perspective, that's stolen land. You fraudulently sold the land. And the federal government and provincial government are guilty to the max on this. And they're not upholding their part of upholding the highest standards of international human rights obligations that they have. These are not the declarations. These are the conventions and treaties that Canada has signed up to. So what they're doing is illegal. And I think every single nation across Canada should lodge an international human rights complaint against Canada.
It sounds like a chain of excuses. Yeah.
It's always been.
Thank you. I'm reading a question from Jessica Rose Lacroix. Where were you involved in the founding of the QNWA?
Well, I'm not that old. I'm not that old. It was founded in 1974, I think. I was 15 years old. So.
Okay. You were president, though, I think, for
I was president
a few years.
In 2004. Yeah. But
okay.
Yeah. No, my aunties and my grandmother's generation, they're the ones that were part of that founding. But
okay. Thank you for clarifying that. And I have a question en français, and I will do my best, from Sue Vallant-Fontaine. Comment percevez-vous la relation du territoire avec les jeunes aujourd'hui?
I can't answer that unless I observe it, not as a youth, but as someone.
Okay.
I can only speak about my community and the other communities that I've met across Canada. In my community, because of the 1990 siege or crisis, there's been a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, and not dealing with that. So the youth, there are youth who understand that, and there are youth who are lost. And I would say we're not doing a very good job of protecting the land. We've tried, but we have gangs here. There's all kinds of criminal elements that have infiltrated into our community, and so the youth are looking at quick money instead of going to school, getting an education. So we have a lot of challenges in the community, and I'll say that not all youth are like that. There are youth who are concerned as much as I am. And across Canada, what I see is the youth are rising, and they're trying to help the people who have been doing this, like myself, for decades, to push back against the colonial structures and colonial oppression. And I think that brings me a lot of hope. So I can't speak to that question in a really detailed way, other than what I've observed.
Okay. And the next question from Jessica Rose Lacroix sort of lends itself to the previous one. Do you think that there's a difference between physically a physical manifestation or rallying, or doing it digitally in regards to activism? So is our physical presence required? Or?
I think you need both nowadays.
I
think you need to use the tools that are effective, and both I would see as equally effective. A lot of protests have speakers there, usually speakers who are knowledgeable. On social media, you do have to be careful sometimes, like anything. So you really have to double check your facts with social media. But I think social media has given Indigenous advocates and activists a new tool that didn't exist like 30 years ago when the crisis happened. We didn't have that. Cell phones were like this big. So I think we need to use as many tools that we can, including broadening the allies, the network of allies that we have. and creating the changes that we need.
Mhm.
For example, François Legault talking about there's no such thing as systemic racism. Well, he needs to be educated. So
Mm.
how do you push for that? And I know social media is a very effective tool in doing that. You can protest in front of the National Assembly, but he's just going to dismiss you. But if you had a petition or you had post-secondary institutions saying, Mr. Legault, we're going to teach you about systemic racism and what that means and what it is. So yeah, I'd say you need to use them all.
Okay. So a blend of the two, strengthening each other, physical and the social media presence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm looking at a question from Tapisa Tulugak. Uh, okay, so can you fight back the government to take your land back through the court system? Is there a way? Is what the question is here? Might be a little broad, so even if you wanted to talk about something specific
Mm.
to,
Well, we shouldn't have to fight
yeah,
Canada and the provinces in the courts. We shouldn't have to do that. Whether it's using the Constitution Act of 1982, but even more so, using Canada's international human rights obligations and making complaints against them. Short of having army tanks to push back, I think that the court system has failed us. The Supreme Court narrowly defines what our rights are. It's not encompassing and it's not comprehensive. So this is where I say reconciliation demands the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery,
right.
which the courts use, right? Even though they're allowed to use, like lawyers can argue international human rights obligations, like the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, of which the UN Declaration is included in that.
Mhm.
But Canada has it's like the UN. They're protecting the elite's interests. They're not protecting, the basic, the citizen, the normal citizen.
Mhm.
They're protecting the rights of corporations because of jobs, because of energy security. Canada needs to be competitive. And you can fight for a long time in the courts. It doesn't. It's not like, okay, I want to take the government to court today,
Yeah.
and today there's a decision that comes out, or your case won't even be heard till maybe a year or two. The courts people want us to feel that this is the peaceful way to get your land
Right.
back. This is the peaceful way, but it's not.
Mm-mm.
As we see with the Mi'kmaq fishermen, they had the Marshall
Yeah.
decision. Nobody's respecting it right now.
Yeah.
They're threatening their safety and security. So I say, sorry, the Canada's legal system because it's not working for us
Yeah.
either. What we need is something much better, and we look at the international level of all those things that could help push Canada and shame Canada once again, as we did in 1990, into saying and accepting and respecting a human right.
Mhm.
Because there are very few lawyers that are able to argue Indigenous law with international human rights obligations. You cannot use solely domestic law to argue your
Okay.
case, and that's what's happened to the detriment of Indigenous people's rights.
Okay. And I think I'm looking at it might be our last question. And
We'll have time for more.
yeah, if anybody wants to, anyone here wants to add a couple more questions, we have one here. Uh, how how do you deal with ignorant or racist people? How do you deal with that?
Well, the first person that comes to mind in that question is the Marivolta.
Okay.
It really tries your patience, I can tell you that. I think it has to do with teaching yourself to be calm, um, to not allow them to get you to react, um, and you can just walk away. There have been instances in my life where people have shouted, racial slurs or other kinds of derogatory remarks, and that is not the time to have a sane discussion. The discussion needs to happen in a safe area. I think everybody who's ever experienced racism understands that you're not going to change the racist's mind. It's already been made up. You need to educate them, and it's always incremental, those changes. So dealing with racism is part of the daily norm for Indigenous people. It's how we deal with it that's important. And I think of Joyce Echaquan again, knowing what was going to happen. She understood the situation she was in and recorded it for the world to see. And I guess that's basically what we need to learn from her is she understood the situation she was in. She was in danger and she couldn't leave. If we are able to leave, then you walk away. You do not engage. And I think it depends on the situation. It's a very challenging situation to be stuck in.
And so we do have another question, and that will be read for us by another teacher. So I'll give the floor to that for one moment.
C'est la question de Karine?
Yes.
Okay. Oui, bonjour. Vous recommandez de faire des lectures pour ceux et celles qui sont allochtones et qui souhaitent être de bons alliés. Quelles sont les lectures incontournables à donner à nos étudiants?
So you're asking which kind of when you say lecture, speeches, right? Speeches, conferences. I cannot, I regretfully have to say that the only ones I know are actually in English. There's some great speeches by Winona LaDuke. Some of the Wet'suwet'en discourse that's going on. I think traditionally, if we take a look at some of the traditional governments, the only ones that, and I know there's other traditional governments right across Canada, but the only ones that I know are mine from, the Iroquois Confederacy. One of the great speeches that I ever read was from Chief Stan George, and he talked about Canada's 100th anniversary, I think in 1967. I was 8 years old then, and I just forgot. I just had someone else in mind. Maybe it'll come back to me. I'm really sorry.
If ever you have a list of readings that can help some teacher with their classes to become allies with the First Nations people, maybe you can submit a list of readings and we can share it with our attendees today.
That would be my pleasure. I know Audra Simpson is another one. Audra Simpson, I think you know her book Mohawk Interrupted.
Yes.
So there's a lot. Kim Anderson does some. Maria Campbell's another writer. You caught me there. You caught me by surprise. I probably should do this at one point. That put down a reading list. I know there was one. Yellowhead Institute is also doing some amazing studies on current situations. So Yellowhead Institute is another one. One of the books that when I was younger that people used to read almost as the Bible was one was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and the other one was something with red in it. Yeah, sorry, I'm having a middle-aged moment, but there's a lot of books. Maybe they seem dated from the 70s or 80s. But they're just as relevant as today because we see that there's not much that has changed, right? Technology has changed, but the issue of assimilation and colonization, or if we put it in a nutshell, imperialism, that has remained the same over the centuries. So, Descahe, that's what I was thinking of. Descahe was a Cayuga chief who went to the League of Nations before it became the United Nations. And he stood there and said, the Confederacy, the Mohawks, Oneidas, Cayugas, Onondagas, and Senecas, and Tuscarora should be part of this League of Nations, which was formed after World War II, right? Which also created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he was ostracized, and people like Britain, Canada, the U.S. Told other states not to listen to him, that he was crazy. So some of the speeches that he had regarding our sovereignty, as the first peoples of this land, I think are wonderful. And that was in the 1948, I think, or something like that. So Descahe, I'll put it in the chat so that you can see how his name is spelled. But he was an amazing person, and he died a very sad man, and but we owe a debt of gratitude to him as Indigenous peoples from around the world for the work that he did in trying to get the international community to see us as nations and not just as little tribes amongst a bigger sovereign nation.
Une autre question en français de Daisy. Est-ce que vous trouvez qu'avoir une organisation politique traditionnelle est préférable pour faire avancer les droits plutôt que les conseils de bande? Do you think that having a traditional political organization is better than band councils for First Nations
rights? Better than
band
council, I will tell you that. Anything is better than band council. They're basically service providers, and they make the financial agreements with Canada, and for education, social services, etc. I would say a traditional government and not an organization. So for me, it's the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. For your nation, how many communities are in your nation, and look at those governmental procedures that your nation has, and it should be equitable between men and women, or have a gender equitable form decision making process. So that's the kind of things that I think that we should be promoting based on fundamental human rights, and looking at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People with your Indigenous laws and complementing each other, because Canada's laws are not working for us. The band council system is not working for anybody. We don't have a criteria, right, for electing people. They just have to be have a big family, and so traditionally, people were selected as leaders because they were taught as small children, and as they grew up, they were around those elders who were teaching them, this is how we do things, and there's a reason why this protocol exists. So in band council, that doesn't happen. It's just like you're elected, you go to meetings with the federal government, they stroke the egos of the band councillors, and the band councillors come back and think that they know more than the people. It's hierarchical. It's not a balanced one. So it's not an offense to anybody who's a band councillor or that system. It's become the norm, and we think it's the norm, but it really is not normal. It's very authoritarian, and the more we realize that it is, the sooner we will make progress for ourselves within our own communities and nations.
I want to thank you again. And there is another question, sort of an observation or a statement, but I think really worth speaking to. Just that it must have been terrifying to face the military. One student has said that. So maybe to ask what that experience was like.
It was terrifying to face the SQ. I was one of 13 women who when the SQ arrived on 5:15 in the morning on July 11th, we went and faced them, and they were like 10 feet away from us with their guns pointing at our heads and our hearts. To me, that was more terrifying. The Canadian Army, yes, because they had big tanks and APCs, and they could run us over anytime, and they had the military power to eliminate us. So I didn't think about it. I just went on automatic pilot, and it's only like years later I dealt with post-traumatic stress.
Right.
For years later. but it was like when you go on automatic pilot, this is where the teachings come in. It's like, okay, this is what we need to do. This is our goal. You always have to be sure of your goal and to deal with that and saying, we want peace. We want people to be safe and to live. So this is what I need to do that. And so, some people didn't react the same, right? They wanted to go and have fist fights. It wouldn't have done anything. So the women went to the front, and because that's our role to protect the land. But yeah, the terror set in later when we had time to think about it.
Right. Thank you. We have another question from Kazia Etienne. It is, how do Indigenous people move forward to become self-sustainable without being dependent on funding or services provided by the government?
I think if you listen to what I said today, you have your answer.
Yeah.
Right? What does it mean to be self-sufficient? Well, you have food sovereignty. Well, to have food sovereignty, and food sovereignty is more than just having food in your stomach. It means having food that is healthy, that is not contaminated. We need to be able to have a decision-making process on everything that affects our lives that is based on equity, it is based on human rights, it's based on the rights of the land in all our relations. And we need to get rid of the band council. We need to kick out the colonial structures of from our communities. We have marijuana shacks here, and the people who put up marijuana shacks in the pines, they didn't ask anybody if they could cut trees. They just did it. So we have a lot of insecurity right now because of that. Had it been done properly, where the community was involved, it might be a little bit different today. But if people are not allowed to participate in decision-making processes, they feel ostracized, they feel left out, they feel angry. And the great law talks about sit in your clans, and each clan makes a decision, and then we talk about it as a whole. We don't talk to each other. In order to have a relationship, a healthy relationship, we need to talk to each other, and we're not doing that. So before we want to talk about being self-sufficient, we need to talk to each other and have reconciliation amongst ourselves. Right. Realize what is the most important thing. We are living in a pandemic, living within climate change that is going to devastate those who are babies right now. They're going to feel the brunt of what's going on. But we need to be really sure what is our goal, and respect the land. We're talking about the land today and all our relations in that land. What is our priority? Is it just to make money? Then we're not going to go anywhere. We need to have a different way of thinking of what survival and sustainability is.
I think that's left us with some really positive words on this talk. And before we break away, I just wanted to check with you. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on?
There's probably lots, but we don't have the time, and I need to go to my class. So I'm a student too. So thank you very much.
We are so thankful. I want to thank you, all the attendees here and our students. We're so thankful to have you here as our special guest today, Ellen Gabriel, and wish you the best as well with the rest of your day. Thank you for spending time with us at noon.
It's a great honor. Thank you, everybody, and I see all the little hands going up. So
it's been an honor meeting you.
Appreciate it. Good luck in all your studies, and to all the teachers on this line. Yawakoa, Sinizariohak, have a great day.
Nyawen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anna, bye-bye.
La prochaine conférence, Philippe Boucher, Vanessa Sit at 13h30. The next conference will be at 1:30. It's Philippe Boucher and Vanessa Sit on health, violence, and territories.
I want to thank all the attendees today for being here. Very, very good questions. Very good interaction with our guest today. And hope to see you in, almost half an hour for the next meeting.